Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we're going to be looking at the Ork warlord Snagrod, also known as the Arch-Arsonist of Shadowdawn. And the reason for why we're going to be looking at him has nothing to do with the box of World War II medals I was recently gifted by a fan who requested this particular episode. Absolutely nothing whatsoever. And thank you for the medals, by the way, they're awesome. So, let's get into it, shall we? First up, it's the title of Arch-Arsonist. Now, in most cases, Ork war bosses simply take whatever titles pleases them, or whatever titles is bestowed upon them by their various nobs and Ork boys. Usually it is more or less flattering, because nobody wants to get stomped on by a war boss, but occasionally it is more descriptive of their personality. In the case of the Arch-Arsonist, however, it's a bit of a oddity amongst Ork kind, because it's a sort of kinda perhaps maybe hereditary title. Granted, it's still hereditary as in Ork hereditary, e.g. whoever manages to kill the old Arch-Arsonist gets to be the new Arch-Arsonist, so I choose to look upon him as the heir in this particular system. This is a bit of an oddity because most Ork societies does not function in quite this way. What is even odder is that the title seemed to somehow shape the Ork. As the title Arch-Arsonist might already suggest, the Ork who bears the title is expected to be rather fond of fire. Now, normally this is not really a thing that Orks do, like they don't follow the example of their predecessors, because their predecessors were obviously shit, because they managed to stomp them. However, in this case, every Ork who's taken up the mantle of Arch-Arsonist has turned into a bit of a rabid arsonist. So, it's a bit of an odd one. However, it doesn't seem to come with any specific gear, so I don't think we can blame this on a magical crown or some other chaos thingy, so it would appear as if this is just some kind of Ork quirk. The Orks of this particular area has decided that their boss is the Arch-Arsonist, and whoever is the Arch-Arsonist is an arsonist. Therefore, they're all arsonists. It's, logical, as far as Orks goes, anyways. And surprisingly, it seems to actually be working. You see, the Ork Empire of Shadowdawn is the largest and longest-lasting Ork Empire in existence. Not only have these burly green fuckers been able to establish an Ork-held empire near the borders of Ultramar, but they've even been able to keep it, despite the fact that they are literally bordering the Ultima Segmentum, which means Ultramarines. And we all know how meticulous and annoying the Ultramarines can get with border control. In fact, the Ultramarines have on several occasions tried to wipe out the Mexican Orks, but so far have been unsuccessful, which is unusual for the Ultramarines because they're usually pretty damn prim and proper in most things they do. In fact, so far, all they've really managed to do is slow the growth of the Ork Empire and stop it from blowing into a full-scale Waaagh. The Ultramarine forces, led by Vario Tigurius, one of the Ultramarines chapter's finest librarians, have been doing this by using said librarian to scry the various Orks' hordes, looking for anyone who has the potential to become a proper big old war boss, and then violently bashing his skull in with power swords. And when one such chieftain has been bashed into submission by the glorious blue boots of the Ultra Smurfs, they move on to the next Ork warlord, and so on and so on and so on. Now, this is what the Ultramarines would call a practical and not entirely ideal solution. It stops the Ork Empire from growing out of control, and it stops them from launching a Waaagh, which is all well and good, but it doesn't actually get rid of the threat. Unfortunately, every single motherfucking creature in the universe has decided that they strongly dislike the Ultramarines, and everything from Chaos to Orks to Tyranids have been invading Ultramar over the last few millennia, which has left the Ultramarines rather busy, far too busy to go deal with a relatively, comparably, minor infestation of greenskin. And for a fairly long time this worked out. The Greenskin Empire was controlled and contained. But unfortunately, even the Ultramarines do occasionally fuck up, and they were not able to prevent Snagrod from gaining power, and he turned out to be just the kind of Ork the Ultramarines had been fearing, you know, the kind to rile up all of the other green brutes and throw them screaming across the galaxy at the closest Imperial-held planet. And to the great and understandable dismay of its inhabitants, the Imperial-held world of Bad Landing turned out to be the closest planet, and was invaded by a massive orc Waaagh in mid-989 millennia 41. Being a relatively small and isolated colony world, Bad Landing didn't have much in the way of chance of stopping an orc Waaagh, or even just halting it, really. But the 3 Imperial Guard regiments located on the planet, the 18th Mordian, the 24th Lamas, and the 49th Boros, or Imperial Guard regiments, did manage to at least stall the Waaagh for a while fighting out of the capital city of Krugerport, which was relatively well defended by colonial standards. It's usually a fairly good idea to fortify one's colonial worlds in the 41st millennium, because there are all kinds of nasties out there in the big dark galaxy that would love nothing more than to eat humans. Or in this particular case, bash them over the head with blunt objects for fun. To make matters considerably worse, this new orc warlord turned out to actually have a brain, which is always a very unfortunate thing when fighting the orcs. Snagrod had come up with a fair few ingenious ideas. Essentially, he'd started copying Imperial Guard doctrine. For example, he began by denying the enemy their means of communications by assassinating several astropaths using so-called commando squads. Not the most subtle of weapons in most cases, but occasionally a few orcs do acquire a certain finesse, and even, dare I say it, hint of subterfuge. And with the planet's small astropathic choir silenced, there was virtually no way for the planet to call for help. They could send a radio signal out into the deep dark void, but it would take years for that to get to, well, anywhere whatsoever, so it's not a very useful plan. However, Snagrod did also turn out to be an orc in another way. Feeling that his conquest was already guaranteed, he himself started blaring out messages all across the void over, well, any means of communication he had. Astropathic, Vox, I'm pretty sure they even raised some flags and flashed some lights into the dark void, bragging about how he would very soon head for Rynn's world, a world populated by a lot of Adeptus Astartes, specifically the Crimson Fists chapter. Now, you might ask yourself, why the hell would he want to go there? Adeptus Astartes are pretty good at fighting, and this is one of their home worlds, which means it's going to be fortified out the goddamn wazoo. However, you gotta remember, these are orcs. They like Space Marines. They actually fucking adore Space Marines, because not only will they give them a nice and solid fight, but they just won't run away. This is an orc's dream scenario, to fight a bunch of heavily armoured, power-armoured psychopaths with chain swords and bolters that will not bloody retreat. Plus, those helmets make for some absolutely wonderful trophies. And no truly respectable orc warlord would ever go out on the town with his nobs without a few Mark IV helmets adorning his boss rack. And luckily for Snagrod, his Vox rantings were indeed picked up by his intended targets, the Crimson Fists, a Space Marine chapter originally descended from the Imperial Fists. Being a collection of remarkably tightly clenched assholes, as all descendants of the Imperial Fists are honour-bound to be, the Crimson Fists couldn't simply let a challenge like this stand, and as such their chapter master Pedro Cantor dispatched the Third Company to take care of this little Snagrod problem. Cantor was convinced that this was in all due likelihood a fairly small orcish invasion and could easily be shattered by the simple elimination of the war boss in charge. He planned to do this by dropping a company of Crimson Fist directly on top of the son of a bitch and sending the rest of the green-skinned brutes screaming back into their little empire to hide and lick their wounds. Unfortunately, there turned out to be quite a lot of orcs, and so the original plans of simply just dumping the Crimson Fist company right on top of the orc warboss was discarded. It was obvious to the Crimson Fists on the planet that this was a considerably larger problem than originally anticipated. They instituted a program of planned assassinations to try and take out the various orc warbosses supporting Snagrod, hoping to break his hold over the orcish horde. Unfortunately, this plan went quite sour quite quickly. A failed assassination attempt revealed the presence of the Third Company to the Orcish horde, who descended upon the Crimson Fists with a fair bit of anger and just a hint of excitement, and drove them back into the capital city of Bad Landing with heavy losses. In the end, only 24 Crimson Fists out of 84 escaped the planet. The Marines that escaped returned to Rynn's world to warn the chapter that this was a far larger incursion than anything they had anticipated. In fact, it was the largest Orc invasion the Imperium had seen since the assault on the hive world of Armageddon, so pretty damn serious nonsense. Unfortunately, Captain Asher of the Third Company was lost on the planet. This loss of leadership, along with the considerable loss of battle brothers, left the Third Company virtually combat ineffective, which was not a particularly great position to be in for the defenders of Rynn's world. They were already down one company, and the largest Orc invasion since Armageddon was heading straight for their doorstep. Not an enviable position, but on the other hand, Rynn's world is an Adeptus Astartes homeworld. This comes with a considerable series of perks for the plans in question, the chief one, of course, being the potential presence of 1,000 Adeptus Astartes should the planet be under any real direct threat, which, of course, is a rather considerable defensive force. Additionally, it usually includes the construction of a fortress monastery, which is essentially a ridiculously heavily fortified castle-like structure somewhere on the planet, where the Adeptus Astartes live, train, and usually also recruit, although in some cases the Space Marine chapters will recruit from other worlds nearby, and then eventually bring them over to the Fortress Monastery once they are full battle brothers. In this case, the Crimson Fist's Fortress Monastery was the Arch-Tyrannus, a damaged battle barge that was crashed into the Hellblade Mountains. A controlled crash, mind you, so most of the battle barge survived the impact, although, you did just crash a battle barge into a planet. It's not going to come out of it entirely intact, but there was plenty of time to effect repairs. After which, the battle barge was essentially built into the mountains, and various fortifications and living quarters were then built outwards from the battle barge, resulting in a very, very formidable defensive work. Additionally, the Crimson Fist chapter was originally formed as a crusading chapter when it was founded, and it was given a fortress monastery of the spacefaring variant. This is essentially a gargantuan spacecraft with enough weapons to level most planets. In this case, it was named the Rutilius Tyrannus, and along with the Rutilius, of course, the Crimson Fists commanded a relatively decent-sized Adeptus Astartes fleet. Now, Adeptus Astartes ships are not specifically designed for naval engagements, relying primarily on their extremely deadly cargo of Space Marines and boarding actions to take care of any naval actions they are forced to engage in, but nevertheless, they are still Space Marine vessels and possess a considerable amount of both firepower, torpedoes, and of course, a crew of rabid psychopaths with chainswords. And lastly, of course, there is the PDF's various gunboats. In most cases, these are fairly small warships, primarily designed to take care of minor pirate activity and keep the civilians in check. You can't have them civvies flying around space all the day, because they'd never get anything done. And naturally, the planet's own defensive measures, including torpedo silencers and orbital defense lasers. To put it bluntly, Rynn's world was about as heavily defended as any world has any right to be, and an Ork Waaagh, regardless of size, would find it pretty dang hard to break it. In fact, original estimates supposed that the Orcs would be crushed in orbit and would not even be able to land on Rynn's world. And even if they were able to land on Rynn's world, Chapter Master Pedro Cantor had recalled pretty much the complete strength of the Crimson Fists, with 600 Marines stationed aboard their fortress monastery and a further 218 down on the planet below. Any Orc invasion was expected to be contained and destroyed quickly by rapid reaction forces of the Crimson Fists and the Planetary Defense Force. In short, the situation was not great. There was a massive orc Waaagh heading straight for them. That's never a particularly sunny day, but the world was well prepared. It had more than enough spaceborne firepower, along with a considerable amount of orbital defenses, and an entire chapter of Crimson Fists plus PDF forces to defend it. Rynn's world was about as safe as it could get in the position that it was currently in. Nevertheless, Chapter Master Pedro Cantor was not by any stretch of the imagination sure of victory. In fact, he was getting a little bit nervous about all of this, because so far, this orc war boss, this Snagrod, had been far too clever by half, and now it looked like this warlord was about to ram his entire strength directly into an extremely heavily fortified position, with very little in the way of an advantage. As far as everything was concerned, it fully appeared as if the Orc Warboss was about to bash his head in against a solid wall of Adeptus Astartes guns. This was highly uncharacteristic, and so far, Waag's Snagrod had been remarkably subtle. They had attacked several other systems and cut them off from communication, both Vox and Astropathic, before crushing the local garrison using what amounted to Planetary Defense Force and Imperial Guard strategies. And now, all of that seems to have flown right out of the window. Unfortunately, there wasn't all that much time to debate how this could have happened, why it could happen, and perhaps more importantly, how to stop it, because Snagrod was not a patient orc, and he was hurling towards Rynn world with every bit of speed he could muster, and Rynn's world was only a few weeks of warp travel away from bad landing. When the orcs finally arrived in system, the invasion proceeded exactly like everyone had originally assumed it would. The orcs launched themselves directly at the Adeptus Astartes and PDF gun line and were destroyed. Hundreds of orc ships were crippled, and the Imperial defenses did not appear to be in any danger of breaking. It would appear that Pedro Cantor had vastly overestimated his opponent. The orc were throwing his forces away in classical orc fashion, and there was no sign of any subterfuge or complex strategy at work. In fact, Imperial estimates created before the battle began had anticipated considerably heavier losses on the behalf of the Imperial defenders than they had currently suffered. And the danger of an orc invasion of Rynn world appeared to be completely neutralized. So far, the orc ships had not even managed to get into orbit, much less enter into a stable position from which any substantial amount of orcs could be launched at the planet below. But that would have been a remarkably boring story, wouldn't it? So the glorious story writers over at G-Dubs decided that a missile was about to hit the Crimson Fist's Fortress Monastery. If this was a role-playing game, I would be calling out the GM for being a massive cuntweasel at this point in time. But that's neither here nor there. A cyclonic torpedo launched from the planet below and from one of the many PDF defense silos appears to have struck the chapter's Fortress Monastery in a rather sensitive spot. Normally, a single cyclonic torpedo wouldn't cause too much damage to a fortress monastery, but as I mentioned, this one came into a rather sensitive spot indeed, and caused massive damage to the fortress monastery, leaving the now crippled fortress monastery right in the path of a massive orc Waaagh. The remaining Imperial ships were completely unable to stop the encroaching invasion, and the chapter master and only a couple of space marines managed to escape the fortress monastery and rejoin their brothers on the planet below. What had appeared to be a crushing Imperial victory and turned into a rather humiliating defeat. In later times, some have speculated that it might not have been a malfunction at all. Cyclonic torpedoes are pretty damn reliable, with numerous fail-safes and complicated onboard guidance systems to ensure that even if the torpedo were to go haywire, it could be remotely detonated before it could hit any friendlies. What had essentially happened here was a 1 in a trillion misfire. And those are some pretty fucking long odds. Long enough for a lot of people to get a little bit suspicious. And some brave souls have even dared to hint that this might have been the work of the Officio Assassinarum. Granted, this would definitely be their style, but it seems an odd target. Being a descendant chapter of the Imperial Fists, the Crimson Fists are about as tight-assed as any Space Marine chapter have any right to be. They don't really seem the kind of chapter to be playing around with heretical nonsense or, having vile interracial sex with Xenos in the bushes. Regardless of who may have been responsible for the fireworks, the outcome was much the same. The majority of the Crimson Fists chapter, over 600 Battle Brothers, were lost, leaving only a little over 200 Battle Brothers stationed on the planet below, including the chapter master Pedro Cantor. Now, 200 Space Marines in a Fortress Monastery is a pretty damn substantial threat to any planetary invasion. However, the Orks now had complete and utter orbital superiority. This was rather bad news, because the planetary defences alone was nowhere near enough to deal with this many Orks. In fact, being Orks, the planetary defences were not even enough to prevent the Orks from going crazy and bombarding various locations of strategic importance. In this particular scenario, staying locked up inside their Fortress Monastery would have been extremely detrimental to the Crimson Fists. Not only would they lose the rest of the planet, but they would eventually be bottled up inside their Fortress Monastery, surrounded, and overwhelmed. Assuming that the Orks didn't simply just glass the entire complex from orbit, it would have been a considerable task to achieve, and it would have cost the Orks dearly, but there is no guarantee that they wouldn't have succeeded. Instead, the Crimson Fists launched a campaign of guerrilla attacks against the Ork invaders. Rather than bolstering the defense of the planet directly, they chose to try and redirect and whittle down the Ork Waaagh that had been unleashed upon the planet. It was blindingly obvious at this point that the Crimson Fist would have to resort to the somewhat dishonourable tactics, because in any area, in any sector, in any province where large forces of Crimson Fists were found to be located, the Orks would immediately be sending large amounts of troops. Their real goal, after all, was the Space Marines. The world itself was a nice bonus, but primarily the Orks were here for a good old fight and some trophies. So, in all due reality, the worst things the Crimson Fist could have done in this situation was to directly bolster the defenders of the planets, as they would have simply drawn the Waaagh straight down on top of them. Unfortunately for the Crimson Fists, Snagrod started to display some of his accustomed tactical brilliance now that he had got both of his giant green legs back on terra firma. He organized several lightning strikes against Imperial-held territory and quickly pushed the human defenders of the world straight back into their strongpoints, leaving most of the planet virtually undefended. This was an absolute humanitarian catastrophe for the population of Rynn's world, who suffered greatly during this part of the invasion, without the PDF to guard them, and, well, any defenses that could be mounted by the Crimson Fists would inevitably just draw more Orks to them. Doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. Snagrod's lightning-fast forces also had a secondary effect. This forced the Crimson Fists to abandon their tactic of guerrilla warfare. Before they did, however, they managed to reconnect themselves with their chapter master Pedro Kant, and eventually retreated into the last city on the planet, the city of New Rynn. This was, by all accounts, a pretty shitty situation. The Adeptus Astartes were deprived of their favoured means of warfare, being unable to launch lightning strikes against the enemy hordes, and were now sort of surrounded in a fortified position. Now don't get me wrong, a Space Marine can hold a fortified position like no one else, and a descendant chapter of the Imperial Fists more so than most, but in this case, the Orks had all of the advantages in an extended siege. They had the numbers, they had the equipment, and they could focus all of it on one small portion of the planet, rather than having to spread themselves out across virtually the entire planet, while chasing down small, highly individual and mobile bands of extremely violent killers. To make matters even worse in a defensive position, pretty much all of the chapter's heavy equipment had been lost, either in the destruction of the chapter's spaceborne Fortress Monastery, or on their battle barge force monastery on the planet. the chapter had essentially been reduced to relying entirely on their battle brothers and a few heavy weapons. They had virtually nothing in the way of tanks or heavy transports, a few rhinos, a few land speeders. That was all that remained of the chapter's once quite considerable armory. Nevertheless, the Crimson Fists are still an Imperial Fist-descendant chapter, and the God Emperor knows you need a lot of boom to push a fist off a battlement. The Speed Freak warbands that made up the bulk of the Arch-Arsonist forces that had been so effective, confining the Crimson Fist inside New Rynn city, were less effective when attacking the fortified city itself. However, the Arch-Arsonist had come prepared, with dozens upon dozens of specialized warbands, all of which brought along a vast number of flaming weaponry, this being a bit of a theme of this particular bunch of orcs, along with over 20 gargants and several specialized stompers known as flame stompers. I'll leave it up to your imagination what exactly that does. And to make matters even more complicated for the Crimson Fists, he had also brought along several flight-capable warbands equipped with deathcopters and warcopters, along with quite a few fixed-wing aircraft, including heavy bombers carrying payloads of, you guessed it, napalm. Or at the very least the orc equivalent, which burns just as hot but is probably smellier. Despite these challenges, however, the Crimson Fists managed to hold out during an 18-month-long siege, culminating with a duel between the Crimson Fist chaptermaster Pedro Cantor and Snagrod himself in New Rynn's spaceport, after Snagrod had called out the chaptermaster repeatedly over the Vox networks. It was one hell of a fight, and the chapter master was heavily wounded in the engagement, but eventually Snagrod was defeated after Pedro Cantor destroyed his personal field generator, which caused considerable damage to the orc. Orcish personal field generators are rather powerful, but somewhat unstable, and when they go boom, well, let's just say that the explosion can be rather entertaining. Snagrod was, however, able to slip away in the confusion, denying the chapter master his final revenge. The siege, both of the city and the planet, was finally broken with the arrival of Imperial reinforcements, with considerable forces of the Imperial Navy, several Imperial Guard regiments, along with elements of the Imperial Fists, White Scars, White Panthers, Stormlords, Angels in Carmine, Blood Drinkers, and Minotaurs, Adeptus Astartes chapters. It would still take several years before Rynn's world was reclaimed, and many planets in the Loki sector are still in the hands of Snagrod and his green friends. It will undoubtedly take a very long time indeed for the Imperium to reclaim these worlds, if they will ever manage to. As for the Crimson Fists themselves, they will also need decades, if not centuries, to regain their former strength, having been left at a mere 100 battle brothers at the end of the siege. It's going to take a very, very long time indeed to regain their former strength, both in terms of men and materials, having lost practically all of their chapter's armory in the siege. As for Snagrod, he is no doubt extremely annoyed at having been denied his rightful trophy by some upstart chapter master, and is currently dealing with some internal strife. In Orc society, getting your ass kicked by the shiny boys is not a very masculine thing, and as such, any Orc warboss is going to have to put up with a few other boys that think that, you know what, maybe Eyes can be's the boss instead. But no doubt, if the Arch-Arsonist of Charadon managed to retain his title, he's going to have some grudges to settle with the defenders of Rynn's world. And that is all for this particular episode of 40k Lore. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.